Hi, I'm Michael and I will be talking about open source. Before I start, have some time to enjoy some memes relating to this topic. Okay, okay, so now that we have seen those memes in the agenda, you're probably asking, what is open source? OpenSource.com defines open source as something people can modify and share because its design is publicly accessible. Open source is made with a special kind of software that has a source code that anyone can inspect, modify, and enhance. Most computer users will never see the source code part of the software. Computer programmers are able to change the source code and impact the way the software works by adding features and fixing the parts that do not work. What is the difference between open source software and other kinds of software? Closed source software or proprietary software has a source code that is only accessible to the person, team, or organization that created it. They maintain control of it and are the only ones who are allowed to modify it. If you want to use proprietary or closed source software, you must first sign a license saying that you will not do anything with the software that the providers have not expressly permitted. Some examples of this kind of software are Microsoft Office and Adobe Photoshop. Open source, however, is different from this. Open source authors make the source code accessible to people who would like to view the code, copy the code, learn from the code, alter the code, or share the code. Like proprietary or closed source software, users will still have to sign an agreement saying that they will follow the rules, but this agreement differs significantly from the closed source one. Many of you have heard the term the open source way. So, what is it? The open source way relates to how the principles of open source get applied beyond software and technology and impact the world in the same way the open source model has changed software. There are 5 different principles to this idea. The first principle is open exchange. Open exchange refers to the free flow of ideas between people. When the information is free and open, it is a lot easier to learn more. The second principle is participation. Open source allows for collaboration among people. This is useful in generating new ideas and solving problems that cannot be solved by only one person. The third principle of the open source way is rapid prototyping. While rapid prototyping does in fact lead to more failures, it will also lead to more solutions. The next principle is meritocracy. Meritocracy is the idea that the best ideas will win. With open source, there will be more ideas and therefore there will be a better pool to choose from. The open source participants will then get to choose which ideas they will support. The final principle of the open source way is community. Communities bring together new ideas and share the work that has been done on those ideas. A community has more capabilities than an individual because there are more ideas and there is more effort. Also, there is not really a limit on how big the community can be. Basically, anyone with the proper devices can join in and add their ideas and information. If you think about it, these principles have and will continue to facilitate the transmission of information from one person to another. This concept will be able to change the world for the better. As you can imagine, there are several benefits to open source software. One of the biggest benefits to it is its cost. Most open source software is free. However, Zivtech.com describes open source software as free as in kittens and not free as in beer, meaning that it requires maintenance, configuration, and ongoing support. Another benefit of open source technology is flexibility and freedom. Like I mentioned earlier in this presentation, open source software can be modified by anyone who knows how to work with the source code. This gives organizations freedom from vendor lock-in and guarantees long-term viability. On average, an open source software project is usually supported by many development shops that can be called on in the future. These shops, along with thousands of independent developers, are constantly reviewing the code for the project. This results in this results in a large peer review process that guarantees security and accountability. With this process, security holes can easily be detected and quickly fixed. Most of the time, the open source software developers in the shops hold similar values. Generally speaking, they believe in community participation, collaboration, and volunteerism. They strive to work together to build free, high-quality products that are accessible to pretty much any organization. As a result of these qualities, most of the popular open source software projects are on the cutting edge of technology. As you can now see, open source software carries many advantages to it that proprietary software cannot match, just based off the nature of it. With all these advantages to open source software, there will also be some disadvantages. There are several times when proprietary software is more practical than open source software. CIO.com lists 7 reasons why open source software is less practical in some cases than proprietary software. The first reason is that open source software is more difficult to use than proprietary software. This can lead to less productivity, which will probably cost more than buying proprietary software. The second reason listed by CIO is that proprietary software is a de facto standard and that there is less compatibility with open source software. The third disadvantage of open source software is the fact that the support offered by the provider is often inferior to that of proprietary software. The next disadvantage is that with open source software, you do not get it as a service. The fifth disadvantage listed is that open source software does not work as well with your hardware. In many cases, open source drivers do not exist. In the few cases that they do, it still might not be the best choice. According to Chris Mattman of the Apache Software Foundation, open source developers may not be able to see the hardware, so the proprietary driver may well work better. The sixth disadvantage of open source software is one of the more important ones. In many cases, open source providers do not provide warranties and liabilities. In some cases, a third party may grant you them, but there is no guarantee of that. Lastly, it is important to have a software vendor that will stick around. While your proprietary software provider might go out of business, that is not necessarily likely. However, it is somewhat likely that the person running an open source project loses interest and neglects it. Before committing to open source, it is important to consider these 7 things. A prominent example of open source software that you probably have heard of is Linux. Linux is an operating system that has been around since the mid-90s. Linux is likely in your phones, cars, and refrigerators. Right now, Linux runs most of the internet and the world's stock exchanges. Something important to know about Linux is that it is free. Some other features include the freedom to run the program for any purpose, the freedom to study how the program works and to change it, the freedom to redistribute copies, and the freedom to distribute your modified copies to others. In conclusion, open source software offers a new and different way of doing things, a way that many people may not know about. With open source software, there are several benefits as well as some drawbacks. It is up to you to decide if this is something that you want to use.